The morning it happened, I was 17 and invincible. Or at least, that's what I thought as I bounded down the stairs of our suburban home, backpack slung over one shoulder, ready to face another mundane Tuesday at Jefferson High. The scent of Mom's coffee and burnt toast filled the air, and I could hear Dad rustling through the newspaper in the dining room, muttering about the stock market. "Sarah, hurry up or you'll miss the bus," Mom called from the kitchen, her voice carrying that familiar note of maternal urgency that I'd grown immune to over the years. "Coming," I shouted back, grabbing my chemistry textbook from the hall table. That's when I saw Marcus lurking at the top of the stairs, his 16-year-old face split by that mischievous grin I'd learned to fear. My older by 11 months brother had always been the prankster of the family, the golden boy who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes, even when his harmless fun left me humiliated or hurt. "Watch out, sis," he called down, his voice sing-song with barely contained laughter. "Karma's coming for you." I should have known, should have seen it coming, but I was running late, and Mrs. Peterson's chemistry test was first period, and all I could think about was whether I'd remembered to study the periodic table groupings properly. The banana peel was strategically placed on the third step from the bottom, not high enough to be immediately fatal, but positioned perfectly to send someone tumbling at maximum velocity. My foot hit the slick yellow skin, and the world tilted sideways. Time slowed to a crawl as I felt my body leave the ground, spinning in a grotesque pirouette that would have been beautiful if it weren't so terrifying. The impact came in stages. First, my shoulder blades struck the edge of the wooden step with a crack that echoed through the hallway. Then my spine twisted, compressing against the unforgiving oak in a way that sent lightning bolts of agony through my entire nervous system. Finally, my head whiplashed back, striking the banister with a sound like a melon dropping on concrete. The pain was immediate and absolute, but worse was what came after the pain: nothing. A spreading numbness that began at my neck and flowed downward like ice water in my veins. I tried to move my legs, to push myself up from the awkward tangle I'd become at the bottom of the stairs, but nothing happened. Nothing at all. "Sarah?" Mom's voice seemed to come from very far away, though I could see her face hovering above me, her features twisted with confusion rather than concern. "What are you doing down there?" I tried to speak, to explain that I couldn't feel my legs, couldn't move anything below my chest, but only a whisper emerged. I can't move." Dad appeared beside Mom, still clutching his coffee mug, his expression more annoyed than alarmed. "Come on, sweetheart. You're going to be late for school. Stop fooling around." From the top of the stairs came the sound of Marcus's laughter, high and delighted, as if he'd just witnessed the most entertaining show of his young life. "Did you see how she went flying? That was epic. I got it all on video." "Marcus, that's enough," Mom said, but her tone was fond, indulgent. The same tone she used when he'd superglued my homework to my desk or replaced my shampoo with honey. "Help your sister up so she can get ready." But I couldn't get up. The realization was creeping through me like a slow-moving nightmare, and with it came a panic so pure and primal that it stole what little breath I had left. "Please," I gasped, looking up at my parents' impatient faces. "Something's wrong. I really can't move my legs." Dad set down his coffee mug with an exasperated sigh. "Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, this dramatic nonsense stops right now. You're 17 years old, not 7. Get up, brush yourself off, and get to school." "I'm not being dramatic." The words tore from my throat with desperate force. "Please, just call 911. Something's really wrong." Mom crouched down, but instead of checking for injuries, she grabbed my arm and tried to haul me upright. When my lower body remained limp and unresponsive, she frowned and tugged harder. "Sarah, stop this right now. Your brother played a harmless little prank, and you're acting like he tried to murder you. Harmless. The word echoed in my skull as I lay there, paralyzed and terrified, while my family dismissed my pleas for help as teenage theatrics. Marcus had descended the stairs now, his phone still in his hand, probably already uploading his epic video to social media for his friends to laugh at. "Maybe she really did hurt herself," he said, but his voice carried more curiosity than concern, like he was wondering if his prank had worked better than expected. "Oh, please," Dad scoffed, reaching down to grab my other arm. "She's just embarrassed. Sarah's always been melodramatic when she doesn't get her way." They hauled me upright between them, my legs dragging uselessly behind me like broken marionette strings. The movement sent fresh waves of agony through my damaged spine, and I screamed, a raw, animalistic sound that should have told them everything they needed to know about the severity of my condition. Instead, Mom just looked exasperated. "That's quite enough, young lady. I don't know what you think you're going to accomplish with this performance, but it ends now." They half-carried, half-dragged me to the living room couch, where I collapsed in a heap, still unable to feel or move anything below my chest. The morning sun was streaming through the windows, illuminating the family photos on the mantel. Images of happier times when I'd trusted these people to protect me, to believe me, to care about my well-being above their own convenience. "I'll drive her to school," Dad announced, grabbing his keys from the bowl by the door. "Maybe a day of classes will knock this nonsense out of her system." "No," I whispered, then, louder, summoning every ounce of strength I had left. "No, please, I'm begging you. Take me to the hospital. Something is seriously wrong with my spine." But my pleas fell on deaf ears. They loaded me into the car like a sack of grain, my lifeless legs flopping grotesquely as they maneuvered me into the passenger seat. The drive to school was a blur of numbness and terror, Dad lecturing me the entire way about responsibility and consequences while I sat there, paralyzed and voiceless, watching the familiar streets of our neighborhood roll by like scenes from someone else's life. At school, the nurse took one look at me and immediately called 911. While we waited for the ambulance, she held my hand and whispered reassurances, the first genuine kindness I'd received all morning. When the paramedics arrived, their professionalism and urgency stood in stark contrast to my family's dismissive cruelty. "Possible spinal cord injury," the lead paramedic radioed to the hospital as they carefully loaded me onto a backboard. Patient reports complete loss of sensation and motor function below the chest. Mechanism of injury consistent with significant trauma. The emergency room was a whirlwind of activity. Doctors and nurses moving with practiced efficiency, ordering tests and asking questions that my parents, who had finally been called to the hospital, answered with increasing defensiveness. "She's always been dramatic," Mom insisted to Dr. Martinez, the attending physician. "She probably just bruised her tailbone and wants attention." Dr. Martinez's expression grew progressively colder as he listened to their dismissive explanations. When the MRI results came back 3 hours later, the silence in the small consultation room was deafening. "Mrs. Morrison," Dr. Martinez said, his voice carefully controlled, "your daughter has a severe compression fracture of her T12 vertebra, with significant damage to her spinal cord. The injury is consistent with a high-impact fall, and the delay in seeking treatment has likely worsened her prognosis." The color drained from Mom's face. But she was just being dramatic. She always—" "Ma'am, doctor," Martinez interrupted, his professional facade cracking slightly. "Your daughter is paralyzed from the waist down. This is not drama. This is not attention-seeking behavior. This is a catastrophic spinal cord injury that required immediate medical intervention. Intervention that was delayed for 8 hours while she begged you for help. Dad sank into his chair, the weight of realization finally hitting him. Oh, God. Sarah, we didn't know. But I was past the point of forgiveness. 8 hours. 8 hours I'd spent in agony, begging them to believe me, while they dismissed my suffering as teenage melodrama. 8 hours during which immediate medical treatment might have made the difference between walking again and spending the rest of my life in a wheelchair. The next few days passed in a haze of medical procedures, consultations with specialists, and the grim confirmation of what Dr. Martinez had told us. The damage to my spinal cord was permanent. I would never walk again. My parents hovered around my hospital bed like guilt-ridden ghosts, their faces etched with remorse and horror at what their negligence had cost me. They brought flowers and apologies, tears and promises to make things right, but I turned my face to the wall and refused to speak to them. Marcus visited once, his usual cocky demeanor replaced by a pale, haunted expression. He tried to apologize, to explain that he'd never meant for this to happen, that it was just supposed to be a funny prank. I stared at him with cold, empty eyes until he left, his shoulders shaking with sobs. It was during my second week in the hospital, while reviewing the legal implications of medical neglect with the social worker assigned to my case, that the seeds of my revenge began to take root. The social worker, a sharp-eyed woman named Janet Reeves, had been documenting everything: the 8-hour delay in treatment, my parents' dismissive response to my pleas for help, Marcus's deliberate placement of the banana peel. "Sarah," Janet said gently, "I want you to understand that you have options here. What happened to you wasn't just an accident. Your parents had a legal duty to seek medical care for you when you reported an injury, and their failure to do so constitutes medical neglect. Legal duty." Medical neglect. The words rolled around in my mind as I lay in my hospital bed, staring at the ceiling and planning my new future. One that would be lived from the seat of a wheelchair, but one in which I would never again be powerless. The lawsuit was filed 6 weeks after my accident. On the same day, I was finally discharged from the hospital to begin the long, painful process of learning to navigate the world without the use of my legs. My parents' homeowner's insurance initially tried to fight the claim, but the evidence was overwhelming. Marcus's own video of the prank, the medical records showing the severity of my injury, testimony from the school nurse about my condition when I arrived at school, and most damning of all, the hospital's detailed documentation of my parents' response to my pleas for help. The local media picked up the story after court documents became public record. Parents ignored paralyzed daughter's pleas for help, read the headline in the Jefferson County Chronicle. "Teen paralyzed in prank gone wrong. Family accused of medical neglect," proclaimed the evening news. The video Marcus had taken of my fall, which he'd proudly uploaded to social media before realizing the severity of my injuries, went viral in the worst possible way. Millions of people watched me tumble down those stairs, saw the moment my life changed forever, and read about my parents' callous response in the hours that followed. Dad lost his job at the insurance company within a week of the story breaking. Mom's position at the elementary school was restructured shortly after. Marcus, who had briefly achieved the kind of internet fame he'd always craved, found himself the target of death threats and harassment from strangers who'd seen his video and read about the consequences of his harmless prank. But the real revenge came 6 months later, when the civil trial began in earnest. I sat in my wheelchair at the plaintiff's table, listening as my attorney systematically destroyed my family's credibility and laid bare the full extent of their negligence and cruelty. The defense tried to paint me as a vindictive teenager seeking to punish her family for an unfortunate accident, but the evidence was too damning. The jury heard recordings of my desperate pleas for help from that morning, watched Marcus's gleeful video of my fall, and listened as medical experts testified about how the 8-hour delay in treatment had turned a potentially recoverable injury into permanent paralysis. The most devastating moment came when my attorney played a recording he'd obtained from the school's security system, audio of my father's voice as he dropped me off at Jefferson High, still lecturing me about my dramatic behavior, while I sat motionless in the passenger seat, paralyzed and afraid. "Your Honor," my attorney said during closing arguments, "this case isn't about a teenage prank gone wrong. It's about parents who chose their own convenience over their daughter's life, who ignored her desperate pleas for help because acknowledging her pain would have disrupted their morning routine. Sarah Morrison will spend the rest of her life paying the price for her family's callousness." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, their verdict was swift and unforgiving. $2.3 million in damages for medical expenses and lost earning capacity, plus an additional $500,000 in punitive damages, specifically for my parents' willful and wanton disregard for my welfare. The judgment was more than my parents' insurance policy would cover, which meant they would have to sell the house, the same house where I'd fallen down those stairs, where I'd begged them for help, where they dismissed my suffering as teenage drama. The irony wasn't lost on me, but the money, satisfying as it was, wasn't the real revenge. The real revenge was watching my parents' faces as the verdict was read, seeing the moment they finally understood the full weight of what they'd done to me. It was the knowledge that they would spend the rest of their lives carrying the burden of their choices, just as I would spend the rest of mine in a wheelchair. The real revenge was Marcus, once the golden child who could do no wrong, now a pariah in his own community, his future prospects destroyed by a viral video and a criminal record for reckless endangerment. He'd gotten his 15 minutes of fame, all right, just not the kind he'd been hoping for. The real revenge was the way people looked at them now when they went to the grocery store or attended church functions, the whispered conversations, the pointing fingers, the social exile that came with being publicly branded as the parents who ignored their paralyzed daughter's cries for help. 2 years later, I'm attending college on a full scholarship, studying pre-law with a focus on medical malpractice and personal injury litigation. I've become an advocate for disabled rights, using my story and the settlement money to help other families navigate the complex world of spinal cord injuries. My life isn't the one I'd planned at 17, but it's a life with purpose and meaning, something I'm not sure I can say about my family. My parents send birthday cards and Christmas gifts, awkward attempts at reconciliation that I acknowledge but don't reciprocate. Marcus moved across the country after high school, trying to escape the shadow of what he'd done. But the internet is forever, and his story follows him wherever he goes. Sometimes people ask me if I regret pursuing the lawsuit, if I wish I'd found a way to forgive my family and move forward together. The answer is complicated, but ultimately simple. They had the chance to choose me, to believe me, to protect me when I needed them most. They chose their own comfort instead. I may be paralyzed, but I'm not powerless. I may have lost the use of my legs, but I found my voice, and I used it to make sure that what happened to me will never happen again, not to me, and hopefully not to anyone else. That's not revenge, exactly. That's justice. And sometimes, in a world where the vulnerable are too often dismissed and ignored, justice and revenge can look remarkably similar. The scars from that morning will never fully heal, not the physical ones etched into my damaged spine, and not the emotional ones carved into my relationship with my family. But I've learned something valuable in the years since my fall. Sometimes the greatest act of self-love is refusing to accept other people's version of your worth. I am not dramatic. I am not attention-seeking. I am not an inconvenience to be managed or a problem to be solved. I am a person who deserved to be believed, protected, and cared for when I was most vulnerable. And when my family failed to provide that basic human dignity, I found the strength to demand it from the world. My brother's prank left me paralyzed, but their response to my injury taught me something even more valuable: that sometimes the people who should love us most are the ones least capable of seeing our truth. And when that happens, we have a choice. We can accept their version of our reality, or we can fight to make our own voices heard. I chose to fight. I chose justice. And in the end, that choice gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever in that fall down the stairs: my power. The house where it all happened sold last month. The new owners have no idea about its history, about the morning that changed everything, about the family that was destroyed by 8 hours of willful blindness to their daughter's pain. Maybe that's for the best. Some stories are too heavy for walls to carry. But I carry my story with me everywhere I go now, not as a burden, but as a badge of survival. Every time I tell it, in courtrooms, at medical conferences, to other families facing their own crises, I transform my trauma into something useful, something that might prevent another person from experiencing what I went through. That transformation, from victim to advocate, from powerless to empowered, is the ultimate revenge. Not because it hurt the people who wronged me, but because it proved they couldn't break me. They could paralyze my body, but they couldn't paralyze my spirit. They could ignore my voice, but they couldn't silence it forever. And that, more than any settlement or public humiliation, is what victory looks like when you're fighting for your own worth in a world that would rather look away. The morning I fell down those stairs, I was 17 and invincible. I was wrong about the invincible part, but I was right about being 17, young enough to learn from the hardest lesson life had to offer, strong enough to build something meaningful from the wreckage of that terrible day. My brother's prank left me paralyzed. My parents' response made them criminals in the eyes of the law and pariahs in the eyes of their community. But my choice to fight back, to demand justice, to refuse to be silenced, that made me who I am today. And despite everything, despite the wheelchair and the pain and the family that will never be whole again, I like who I've become. That might be the greatest revenge of all, turning their cruelty into my strength, their dismissal into my determination, their failure into my success. The girl who fell down those stairs is gone, but the woman who rose from that fall is unstoppable. And that's a story worth telling, a victory worth claiming, and a life worth living, no matter what anyone else might say about it.